Welcome to the third and final CE session of the conference. And before I go any further, I just had a couple of housekeeping items. So I would like to remind everyone that this session is being recorded for all of the conference attendees and registrants to watch later. Although the planned breakout rooms will not be recorded. Also, if you have questions as we go along, please feel free to post them in the chat, and I will be monitoring that along with my other CE organizers so that we can assist with getting those answered. Okay, our session this morning is led by Dawn Behrend, and it is titled Self-Care 101. So we will be learning how to recognize signs of burnout and trauma, as well as develop effective strategies for self-care. So things I know that I really need to work on. Ms. Behrend joins us from Lenoir-Rhyne University in North Carolina, where she is an instruction and outreach librarian and liaison for business and economics, mathematics, computer science, human services, psychology, and counseling. In addition to her MLS and MBA degrees, Ms. Behrend also holds a BA in psychology and MA in clinical psychology. And prior to becoming an academic librarian, she worked as a clinical psychologist, and she continues to work part-time in private practice providing psychological evaluations. So I'll turn it over you to Dawn, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Share my screen here. Let's see here. Hopefully, let's see. You should be. Do you see it now?
Yes.
Yes. Great. Okay. I'm kind of not used to this. I'm used to Zoom. So, okay. So, and like the host mentioned, if anybody wants to put any comments in the chat, feel free. Also, you can feel free to unmute yourself if you want to make a comment or ask a question. That won't bother me at all. So feel free to do that. We already have my introduction here. I think these slides will be available to you if you have interest in learning more about me. I do have a online portfolio at my Wix site, and there's my contact information. If there's anything you want to contact me about after the presentation, feel free to do that. So we're going to do two parts in today's session. We have it down for about 2 hours. And so the first part, we're going to talk about, self-care and why it matters, to identify, what are some physical and emotional impacts that stress might have on us, to recognize signs of burnout or vicarious trauma that we might be experiencing. And then we're going to have time for a breakout room as well. So we're going to go through these things, have time for a breakout session where you can talk about these things, little question and answer time, and then we'll take a break and come back for the second half. So that's kind of our agenda for the first part. Okay, so just to kind of make sure, you hear about self-care a lot. So just to talk about what do we mean by self-care? What is it? What is that exactly? So really self-care can be any activity that you do that is going to improve your mental, emotional, spiritual, or physical well-being. So it's really broad. It's whatever that is for you that's going to improve your well-being in these areas. And that can be different things for different people, obviously. So there's lots of reasons why we might be stressed right now. So just a kind of a quick reminder of why self-care is so important is that we've all been dealing with this COVID pandemic that just kind of keeps going and going. On top of that, there's the political upheaval we've all been experiencing together, lots of financial stressors, the stock market, retirement accounts, housing market, we got climate change, parenting obligations, elder care. So just, not to stress you out too much on a Friday, but there's a lot that we all deal with every day beyond just, our work that we do. So sometimes we get used to that. We get normalized to living in a very stressful situation. But it's important to recognize that these things are going on and it's having an impact on you. So then, of course, there's work, so in terms of our work, there's lots of things that can be stressful there. I was talking with, your conference host before I put this session together, and some of the things they mentioned in Illinois, especially with health science librarians are things like, your state budget keeps fluctuating. There's a lot of pressure on all of you to keep proving that there's value in what you do to be funded. Many of you work in isolation, and maybe just one or two of you at a particular library. You might be in an administrative role where you have to manage staff issues. And of course, we don't really like to use the term difficult patron, but there can be patrons that are difficult and they can be stressful to deal with on top of all these other things. So, again, the other thing we talk about is stress. And so, we have different, understandings of what stress might be. So just to kind of clarify what we mean by stress. So really, stress is your body's reaction to any change that requires an adjustment or a response. So we tend to think of stress as being something bad happens and we have this emotional reaction. But really, it's anything that could be something that you have to respond to and you have to adjust to. And so when we adjust to these things, it could be physical, mental, emotional. So there's lots of different things that our bodies do to respond to these different stressors in our lives. And the other thing is that the stress can be something that's physically in front of you. It could be somebody, a patron yelling at you on the phone. Or we even can experience stress if we're thinking back on something stressful that's happened. So if we had a difficult interaction with somebody at home and we're at work and we're thinking about that, our body is still experiencing that stress in the same kind of way. And really, our body can't tell the difference between a good stress and a bad stress, something good or bad. It's just responding to changes. It knows it has to do something to get us ready to respond. There's lots of stress screeners. So we're going to talk about some of those in a minute too. But one of those is the Mental Health America. That's a grassroots advocacy group. This is not an official psychological test, but it is something that you can just take. And it kind of gives you an indicator of how stressed you might be at this point in time. So just kind of taking a little check of yourself to see where you're at with that. And we'll talk again, more screeners coming up that we'll talk about. And like I mentioned, stress is stress. So even positive things can be very stressful. So, if you got married, if you bought a house, if you got a promotion, if you retired, if you had a child, those are all wonderful things. But you might notice sometimes when these things happen, you're thinking, I should be on top of the world, but I feel horrible. It's because you're trying to adjust to something that's a big shift, a big change. Some negative things that people are going through that clearly are stressful are things like a divorce, being chronically physically ill or dealing with a mental illness, losing your job, or the death of a loved one. So there's lots of different good and bad things that can happen to us that nevertheless can cause us to feel stressed. So if we don't address these chronic stressors, we can experience lots of different outcomes, physically, cognitively, emotionally, behaviorally. It's going to at some point have an impact on us. So I think sometimes in our society, and I'm guilty of this too, is feeling like we have to kind of white knuckle through certain things, like we'll think, well, I'm just going to get through this and then I'm going to go to do the next thing and the next thing. But your body doesn't take that time out. You're still adjusting, you're still responding, even though you're trying to do mind over matter kind of thing. All of these things are kind of going on in the background and that are going to continue to be there unless you do something to try to address it and mitigate. You can't make the stress stop. Life keeps coming at us. But we can do things, which is the whole point of this webinar or training today, is to talk about what we can do in terms of self-care to try to, like I said, mitigate the impact of the stress. So, when you do experience a stressor, there's some different things that go on in your body. And you probably remember some of these things, from if you ever took Psychology 101 or anything like that. But just as a reminder, when something does stress us, we produce adrenaline. So that's that fight or flight. And some people it's freeze. But something happens and our body kind of produces this adrenaline to get us ready to react. And then cortisol is what our body releases to kind of get us back in balance after we respond to something. So when you have chronic stress, you kind of have one stressor after another, your body makes more cortisol than it can get rid of, So I think you've probably heard of things like, adrenal gland burnout and things like that, because you just have so much cortisol just lingering there in your body. And what that does is, over time, research has shown that that can actually shrink your prefrontal cortex. That's the part of your brain that makes those executive functioning decisions, stop, think, act, do. And so you might find that you're having trouble with your memory or learning new things. You're just not quite as, sometimes people use the term brain fog. In my practice as a psychologist, quite frequently I do testing on adults who typically have pretty stressful jobs, pretty stressful lives, and they might be in their 30s, 20s, 30s, 40s, and they're thinking, maybe I have ADHD and I just never got it diagnosed. I need to get on a stimulant so I can keep doing these things that I'm doing. And then we do the testing, and really, cognitively, they don't have ADHD. They can do all the things somebody can do that doesn't have ADHD, but they're under so much stress that they actually feel like there's something wrong with them cognitively. And then sometimes you do just test people, they do have ADHD, but actually it's more common than not that they don't. And it's really just their stress and their life circumstances that are causing them to have these difficulties. So, we mentioned that this cortisol and stress can kind of shrink our prefrontal cortex, but at the same time, it increases our amygdala. So that's the part of our brain that processes our emotions and how we respond to emotional things. So it kind of puts us in this kind of ongoing cycle where, because of that, we're actually more receptive to stress, we're more emotionally responsive. So we are more stressed, we have more cortisol, and on and on and on. So it's like, we have to kind of break that cycle so that we're not constantly in that fight or flight mode. And so on the screen here, I won't read all this to you, but you can see there's just a range of things that people can really feel physically. They feel horrible, stomach issues, weight issues, can't concentrate, like I mentioned, might feel very anxious or moody. They might do things, they really, bad habits like drinking too much or smoking or, just being withdrawn from people. So all of these things are kind of indicators that there's something going on that we really need to address. And again, these aren't to freak you out or make you worried, because there are things you can do about it. And that's kind of what we're going to focus on more so in the second part of this webinar. But it is important to recognize that if you don't do something about it, there could be some difficulties there. So there's lots of little stress screening tools. Like I mentioned, we already talked about the stress screener for Mental Health America. There's also the perceived stress scale. So that one can help you kind of get a gauge of how different situations are affecting how you feel. So what that means is that what might be stressful for one person isn't necessarily stressful for somebody else. So, so it's everybody's different. So, it's all how you're thinking about it and perceiving what's happening to you that kind of generates that stress response. So this kind of just helps you kind of figure out where you're at in terms of how you're perceiving things in your life at this point in time. And then there's the Holmes Rahe. You probably have heard of this one. It's also called the Social Readjustment Rating Scale. This is one that, probably is really important now that we're living in this time of COVID and where we're kind of vulnerable to physical illnesses. This one is really kind of looking at if somebody has had a number of different stressful situations, and good and bad, it counts for both, you are more at risk for developing a significant health issue in the near future. So you can kind of take a look at that and kind of rate yourself, and it'll tell you, based on what you're experiencing now, are you at risk for having a health issue in the next 2 years or so? And again, these are good things to kind of say, maybe I need to start doing some things to kind of get this under control and to take care of myself before it gets to that point. So I would definitely say it's worth the time. None of these take a long time to do. So, be able to go in there, and they're freely available online. to use these things. Now, there's also things that we experience that are unique to us as librarians. So when I started my career as an academic librarian, the people that I worked with in the mental health field were like, oh my goodness, you're just going to sit around and read books all day and you're just going to be, shelving things, and goodness, how nice would that be? And I didn't really think that would be the case, but that is the perception of people outside of librarianship sometimes. And I can honestly say there's things about being a librarian that are way more stressful than my job as a psychologist. So I love being a librarian. I'm happy I made that career change, but it does have its stressors. It's something I love the field enough that I'm going to continue to do it regardless of those stressors. But we have to acknowledge, like, what are some things that really are difficult for us as librarians? And so some of those things here, we can kind of take a look at this. We all probably can recognize our workload, as people retire or leave, their positions aren't always replaced. So we can end up doing somebody else's job on top of our own. I'm part of a very small staff, and so we all have to kind of cover for each other, and that can be difficult. There's inflexibility in your scheduling. So, as a mental health professional, I can make my own schedule. As a librarian, I have to be available when the building's open, when people need me, and that's a must. For those of you that are working in one-person libraries, you don't have the option really just to close and stay home or go take care of yourself always. So there's that. Sometimes we don't have clear expectations from our management, so you may not really have somebody that's giving you clear directives about, what's going to be good for you, for the library, what's expected. It's just kind of, open-ended. So that can be stressful. We might have difficult coworkers or patrons. Lots of work interruptions being a librarian. People just, it's just, you just got to shift gears constantly throughout the day. It's hard to focus on one thing and get that one thing done. And there's also demands to learn new technologies. I know that's something that a lot of you are dealing with as well. So, you're having to learn new things all the time, teach that to people that use your libraries. And that can be a good thing, but it can also be very stressful as well. So budget cuts, I know that in your state, in my state too, there's lots of challenges with enough money to go around. And then there's concerns with that as we are possibly heading into a recession. Get really high pay as librarians. So even though we do really good work and we do a lot of things for our communities, that's not always reflected in our salaries and our pay, and that can take a toll over time. The lack of recognition, like I mentioned, people sometimes perceive librarians as not being, professionals, or that we have a very easy job and don't always recognize everything that we do. And that can be in a public library, a health library, academic library. There's always kind of a disconnect there in terms of how we're perceived as professionals. Don't have a lot of control over our work environment. Like I mentioned, the building hours are the hours. People that come in or who come in, we can't say, no, I don't want to deal with this today. So we just have to kind of deal with it as it is. Some of us work in libraries that are old, needing renovation, and so we're having to deal with that. And that can be kind of taxing over time too. Not a lot of the opportunities to advance. It tends to be a pretty flat type of organization that most librarians work in. You can kind of have a entry-level job, or that it kind of jumps to dean and or manager, director, and there's not a lot in between sometimes, so that can be stressful. And there's a lot of talk right now about low morale in the field. There's a lot of people talking about that, and so that's something that hopefully will improve and get better. But these are just some realities, not to bum you out. I like I said, I love being a librarian. I think it's wonderful. The goods most definitely outweigh the negatives for me, but I think it's important that we recognize these are things we're dealing with, and that we do have to take care of ourselves to deal with these kind of stressors that we're facing. The next thing I'm going to kind of get into is burnout and vicarious trauma. And I can't see the chat, so if there's anything going on in the chat, feel free to interrupt or let me know that. But or again, if you want to unmute yourself, if you have any comments you want to make about what I've discussed, feel free to do that too. So burnout, we'll just kind of talk about that. So with all of these things that are going on, we are at risk to face these things. So there's a difference between burnout and vicarious trauma. So with burnout, this is really the kind of the standard definition of burnout is that it's a state of mental, emotional, and physical exhaustion that's caused by excessive and prolonged stress. Now, this is typically something that we think about in terms of a work environment. So, the emotionally or physically demanding work. But it can also be, you can hear about caregiver burnout. So maybe you are doing great in your job, but you have to go home and take care of an elderly parent, or you have young children that you're taking care of. So anything that's just really kind of over time, just demanding in an emotional, physical way, can kind of set you up for the potential of burnout. So just to be aware of what that is, and so with burnout, there are some clear signs that you might be experiencing this, and it can kind of sneak up on you. So it's one of those things that, like I mentioned, it's over time. It's not like one bad thing happens and suddenly you're burned out. You could be in the field for years and suddenly realize kind of, oh, this has been going on, this has been happening. But one of the key features is that physical and emotional exhaustion. You just really feel like just fatigued with it. You don't have a lot to give in terms of energy level, oomph, whatever you want to call it, for the job, whereas you may once have felt that way. A sense of cynicism and detachment. So maybe you were somebody that was always glass half full, and now you're like all negative. I don't want anything to do with this library, these coworkers, the community. Leave me out of it. I'm just going to go sit in my office and do my thing. So that can be something to think. Is that something that's been a change for you? Like, were you not typically that way? But now, you just kind of have this kind of negative outlook on the library, community, those kind of things. And then the big thing is that feeling of ineffectiveness and lack of accomplishment. So like, you might feel like, well, I could do these things, but why? Nothing's going to change. I can't make an impact on anything. I haven't accomplished anything. Even if that's not true, you could look back at your curriculum vitae, your resume, and think, oh, okay, I did this committee, I did this thing, and I helped that person, and but you don't feel that you've done that. In your heart of hearts, you're feeling ineffective and that you haven't accomplished anything. So these are some signs that really it's time to take a look at burnout. Now, the good thing about burnout is that you can improve this situation. This is not an end of career moment here. This is something, if you can kind of take a look at it and make some environmental adjustments. So it's really, like I mentioned, related to this prolonged stress in a certain environment. So for some people, that is a job change, and that could mean leaving the field. But for a lot of people, it's maybe changing the type of job that you're doing within the field. Maybe you were in a public library and now you're going to an academic, or you were working in a certain, you were doing reference at your library and now you're doing outreach. And so there's lots of different ways that you can kind of reconfigure what you're doing. And it does take effort, it takes time to make those changes, but it would be worth it, to take a look at, what could help you in terms of changing things up with your current situation. Taking your time off, if you're one of those people that just doesn't feel like you can take off or shouldn't take off, you have to examine that and really use your paid time off. Carve that time out for you, take that time, and just any other environmental modifications. For me, I was in a small library, like I mentioned. I do best when I can just kind of be in my own space and focus. And I was sharing an office with two other people when I first started my position. And I just really advocated that, you know, my coworkers were fine with that, and I loved them. They were wonderful, but I wasn't getting anything done. It was very stressful. So I did notice there was a space in the library that I could use for an office, and I kind of had to kind of keep pushing for that. But over time, I was given the opportunity to have my own space, and that helped me tremendously. So, you know, rather than saying, I hate this library, I'm leaving, you know, I just kind of kept explaining to my director why, for my working style, that was better for me and that was able to happen. So, you know, hopefully, you know, you can look at some of those things for yourself. And it's not always possible to make big changes like that, but, you know, maybe kind of think about how you could start looking at some of those modifications that would be meaningful for you. Now, there's another thing called vicarious trauma. So this is totally different from burnout. This was something that began more like in social work, counseling, but it does apply to the work that we do as librarians, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. But the official definition of this from the American Counseling Association is that vicarious trauma is the emotional residue of exposure that counselors have from working with people as they're hearing trauma stories and become witnesses to the pain, fear, and terror that trauma survivors have endured. So, you know, counselors were noticing that when they were working with people that experienced trauma, were sharing their trauma, they themselves began to experience symptoms as though they had been traumatized. And then again, this has extended to lots of other fields. So, you know, with librarians, you know, and I have people that I've worked with that are like, oh, how in the world do librarians have vicarious trauma? But they do, and you know, and it may be more so in some settings than others. So, you know, in my library, again, small library, academic library, not a lot of things that happen that are traumatic that I would, luckily, I knock on wood, have experienced. But I do trainings for, you know, Amigos libraries and Librarians Academy, and people share, especially the librarians that are in like larger academic libraries and in public libraries in cities, larger cities, they experience quite a bit of vicarious trauma. So for us as librarians, this could be just hearing our patrons tell us about things that they've experienced. So, you know, we are part of our community. For those of you in health sciences, you know, I'm sure that people come to you and share things that have happened to them as they're trying to find information for themselves. So, or you may have to read about some of these things as you're trying to, you know, provide information to providers that have questions about this. But just hearing these stories can put you at risk for vicarious trauma. And we might see our patrons are just struggling with the effects of abuse, neglect, domestic violence. So even if they're not coming to us and telling us about it, we can kind of see that they're going through these things in their lives, and it's very stressful for us to see that they're experiencing this. And we may also witness some things. So this would be more of a direct trauma, but you know, if we see our patrons, you know, screaming at each other, getting aggressive with each other, even though they're not directing it towards us, we're still witnessing it, we're seeing it. And so that can be traumatic for us as librarians. So there's some signs to kind of look for if you're thinking, this might be me, I've been through some of this, I'm wondering. The difference between vicarious trauma and burnout is that with vicarious trauma, it really changes how you view the world. You know, to you, after this has happened, the world is no longer a safe place. You know, you kind of expect the worst out of things. You know, you don't feel safe. So it changes how you see the world itself around you. Behavioral changes. So, you know, in burnout, you know, we're tired, we're not feeling too good about stuff, we're not trying as hard as we used to. However, with vicarious trauma, you might notice in yourself or coworkers that they're doing things they just wouldn't typically do. So maybe things that are more impulsive, maybe even like kind of self-defeating, just out of character for them. And so they just are not acting like themselves. So that you see those changes in how they're behaving at home and at work. And they might express or you might feel a sense of hopelessness. So, you know, like I said, with burnout, you're not feeling like the greatest, you're not feeling too effective, but you don't necessarily feel hopeless about everything. Your job, yeah, you're not feeling great about that. But with vicarious trauma, you just feel hopeless. There is no point to anything. Why bother? And so that's the difference there. And then people with vicarious trauma can be very emotionally labile, so more moody than they normally would. So maybe lashing out, being more, likely to cry or become upset than they normally would, more reactive to triggers. And so if this is something that maybe the person hasn't thought about and they don't kind of see themselves as having experienced trauma, they may not realize that there's certain things that are triggering them. It might be a patron that looks a certain way, or a tone of voice, or even the lighting or time of day can be triggers to things that have happened. So just being aware of that. And the hypervigilance. So people with vicarious trauma are always kind of on edge to watch and kind of scan what's going on around them. So, is who's coming in the doors, or somebody behind me? Is that person reaching in their pocket for something? Like just being on edge about things that could possibly happen and not really being able to turn that off. There's a time when we have to, be aware of that these things can happen. But with vicarious trauma, it's kind of a constant, even when you don't have to be that way. And this would be, across settings, not just at work, but at home as well. And then something that really people notice with this is that they kind of lose that ability to be empathetic or compassionate to others. So maybe you really cared about your patrons and you really could kind of put yourself in their shoes and, really want to help them. And but then you find that, that's their problem. I don't care. They put themselves in that situation, whatever. That would be a sign that, oh goodness, the vicarious trauma is something that could be affecting you as a librarian, that you can't even feel that sense of concern for others. And that can be distressing for people that were typically have been very compassionate people. It feels bad to not be able to feel that. So that's another sign of vicarious trauma. And this is not something that you can just fix by changing things in your environment. Burnout does take some work. You got to, make the efforts, put in those changes, have those conversations with your supervisor and yourself. With vicarious trauma, that's not enough. This is really something that really has changed how the person is functioning and sees the world, and probably needs something more along the lines of maybe counseling or something like that. Now, there is a vicarious trauma toolkit. This is from Office for Victims of Crime. Lots of resources here. So the biggest thing to remember is not to minimize what you've been through. So if you feel like, well, yes, I heard about this person's trauma, but it wasn't me, it was them that it happened to. Why do I need, how can I make this about me? That seems wrong. That's not the case, so just to be aware that it does impact you, and that there are resources out there, and something to share with your coworkers. So if this is something that you're hearing about for the first time and you're thinking, wow, maybe this is something my coworkers need to know about, this is a toolkit that you can share out with them so that they can kind of take a look for themselves and find some resources. Okay, so I did kind of whip through that stuff pretty quickly. So I did want to take a moment before we get into our breakout sessions to see if anybody has any comments or questions. And if not, we'll kind of get into our breakout session. So is there anything in the chat or anything anybody wants to unmute themselves for before we get into our breakouts?
Nothing in the chat so far.
Okay. Okay. Well, in the breakout session, I think it is important. The second part of our session is going to address more of the self-care. So I've given you these things to be aware of. But before we get into that, having a chance to talk to one another, you are, in some unique situations in terms of being in health libraries, health sciences. So some of the things that you face are going to be different than maybe something in my library. So some time to connect with each other. So you can talk about whatever you want to, but some ideas that you could talk about are what are some of the stressors that you're facing in your position or your library? It could be your personal life too, if you want to talk about that. Good and bad stressors. And then any challenges that you think you might be experiencing with burnout or vicarious trauma or both. And I think, the breakout sessions aren't recorded, so that would be your time to have some time to talk with somebody else that's in a similar field to you. It's only 10:05, so I think we had originally said maybe about 5 or 6 minutes. So that time can be flexible if you feel like you want to do longer breakouts, whatever you want to do. So let's see. I'm gonna stop my share here. I think I can figure that out. Okay. And our next part of our session will be longer. We'll have more to go over, but so a 5-minute breakout session seem okay to everybody? Okay, so just a few minutes to connect and talk about those things would be good. And then we'll come back and see if you have any questions or want to share anything you talked about. Okay, so I guess we're all back here now. We had a nice long breakout session. We weren't sure when it was going to end. It was
Sorry,
nice that people got it. No, it's good. It was
took a few minutes to get everyone in. I wanted to make sure everyone had a time to speak.
No, there was
because if
plenty
I'd
of
done the
time.
actual 5 minutes, one person would have talked and then I would have kicked everyone out. So
No, I think in my group that I was in, I think a couple of us, Holly and Laura in particular, might have made a connection because they're both early career and trying to prevent this scary burnout that I've been talking about. So hopefully people have done that in their other breakout rooms, or they've met some people or kind of been able to share some similarities of what they're going through. But we do have time for a break. So would people like to take a break at this point and then come back at 10:30? Or if you need less or more, you just tell me. We have time for a little break if people want to get a cup of coffee or what have you, and then we can get
9:30 Chicago time.
Okay, yeah, I'm in Eastern time. Yep.
I would appreciate a 10-minute break to get
Perfect.
coffee.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's come back at 9:30, 10:30, whatever time zone you're in. So I'm going to mute myself and all that, and I'll be back at the 30-minute mark.
Sounds good. All right, looks like we are at 10 minutes, so I think we can go ahead and continue on.
Okay, great. Share my screen. You should be seeing my slides here. Okay, so
yes.
Now that we're all back here for our second part, there's some things we're going to cover that are more directly related. We're going to talk about self-care strategies, so what we can do about some of these stressors we've talked about. We also want to talk about how can we recognize if maybe this is shifting into more of a mental health concern, something we might need to address in a different way. And if we do need professional help, how to find that, how to get that. And we'll also have another breakout session towards the end of this, so we can talk a little bit more with each other about some ideas for our self-care. So there'll be an opportunity for that as well. And if there's any questions that anybody has or any comments they want to make, we'll have time for that as well. So talking about self-care, that's why you're all here today, is to find out what to do about all these things. So one of the first things is, sometimes we start rattling off all these things we could do, activities, is just to kind of think about yourself and like, how do you experience stress? So, and like I mentioned with burnout, sometimes it can kind of just sneak up on you. And so you think you're doing okay, and until you're not. So what are some signs for you that you're stressed? Are you thinking things differently or engaging in different behaviors than you normally would? So just kind of picking up on your cues for yourself. Some people might have, physical problems. Their stomach might be upset, or they have, stress in their neck or their joints or whatever. So those are all things that can trigger you or let you know that you're having stress. Other people is more behavioral. Maybe you have some habits that you broke and now you're doing those things again. And but just kind of tuning in with yourself about what's going on. And then try to pinpoint as much as you can, what are the things that are stressing you out in your life, and can you problem solve that? Some things you can do something about it. You can gain some control over that stressor. You can, set some boundaries like we're going to talk about in a minute. You can reorganize things, prioritize. So just what can you do to kind of get a handle on these different stressors that are in your life? And again, recognizing how you're dealing with that stress. So are you leaning on some healthy coping mechanisms? Are you falling back into maybe some negative things? And so most of us do a combination. We might go to the gym and that's great for us, but then we're going to sit and, eat a Snickers bar while we're watching Netflix for 3 hours or something. So, nobody's going to do it all right or all wrong, but what are some things, what are some healthy coping skills and some not so healthy ones? And what are you doing with those things? So to help you get started with that, this is a really good tool. It's called a self-care assessment. It's actually from the University of Buffalo School of Social Work. They have a lot of resources on their site. So they've created this. This is not something that's going to give you like a score, like you have a 20, so therefore you need to do this. But it's just a chance for you to go through and kind of look at these different areas of your life. It takes a look at your physical, psychological, emotional, spiritual, relationships, professional, like what are you doing at this point in time, and trying to find some patterns, trying to find some balance in what you're doing in terms of your work and your professional life. So before you launch in and start doing some activities, kind of just figuring out where are you at, what is your benchmark for this before you start doing those things. So there's things we can do, once we do this assessment, what are some things we can do in our personal life, in our working life that can make an impact and a difference for us? A lot of these things you probably already know it, but it kind of can be helpful to hear it again. So things like exercising, and that doesn't mean you have to go and do, powerlifting at the gym or anything like that, but even just maybe walking, 10 to 20 minutes a day, getting out and just moving, some kind of movement that feels good to your body, that you're being active in some way consistently. And trying to eat a healthy and balanced diet. When we're stressed, that's when we need good nutrition in our bodies, but that's also the time when we think, I don't have time for that, I don't have time to go to the store, I don't have time to cook. But you have to make that time. You have to really, and there's ways that you can do it that are quick and easy, but we live in a society of processed foods, and it's easy to grab something like that rather than eating something like more of a whole food. But just noticing when you're kind of, your balance, your diet is getting, off kilter with those things. Reaching out for your support of your family and your friends. I know for myself, when I'm stressed, I get pretty withdrawn. I just want to be left alone, be by myself, and that's not always best for me. So I make myself a promise, like every week I'm going to do something outside of work, even if I don't feel like it, I will enjoy it and I'll feel better after I've done it. So, reaching out and, doing something with people that are in my life rather than just kind of, isolating myself from the stress. So sometimes you have to push yourself to do that, but it can really have a good impact. Sleep, I'm sure in our society, most of us struggle to get good sleep. We have the blue lights in our face from our tablets and our phones. We're trying to do as much as we can during the day. So sometimes, we feel like we can't even get our sleep because there's so much to do. But, without our good, healthy sleep, all these other things that we're going to try to do, it's going to be kind of an uphill battle. So sleep is really essential to get. Staying hydrated is super important. We all know this, but there's all kinds of resources to help. You can put an app on your phone that tells you it's time to drink water. I have this water bottle that has like time segments on it. So if I haven't, I think I'm doing well on my water, but then it'll tell me, oh, I was supposed to have already drunk this by a certain amount of time. So it kind of helps you not lose track of time and to make sure you get your water throughout the day. So little tips and tricks like that can be helpful. But being dehydrated on top of everything else is definitely going to make things harder for you. There's other things we can do in our lives to help ourselves, with our self-care, just in our off hours. And that would be, working in some pampering. I think a lot of us don't do that. Like maybe we're taking care of children or elderly parents, and it feels selfish to sit there and do something that's more of a luxury. But I think that, you're going to be more productive and more effective in your life if you take that time out to do something for yourself, and just to kind of, give yourself a little bit of a treat. It doesn't have to be anything super expensive either. It's just whatever for you is a luxury, and that could be just having, some nice bath salts at your own house. I belong to a gym. It's not an expensive gym. It's just a basic gym, but they do have a sauna. So like I go and I use that sauna. Even when I'm feeling stressed, I make sure that I work time in to go do that. So there's lots of things that you can just make the time to do. Finding a hobby is important. I think we did get disconnected from things that we used to enjoy. Maybe as your kid, you enjoyed riding your bike, or you enjoyed, doing jigsaw puzzles, or just reconnecting with something that you used to enjoy, but you haven't made time for, or maybe trying something new, something you've never done before, but we're always interested in. So that would be something you could do. For me, it's cross stitching. I used to cross stitch when I was in high school and whatnot, and I've recently started doing that again, and I really enjoy just having that time to do that. Spirituality is something we don't want to forget about. That doesn't mean that you have to go to church. It doesn't mean that it has to be Christianity. It's whatever that is for you. For some people, that's just being out in nature, like feeling more connected with the world around them. So whatever that is for you, making time for that aspect of yourself as well is important. Mindfulness, there's some slides we'll talk about what mindfulness is and just kind of how to get started with it. But I'm sure you've all heard there's a lot of awareness about mindfulness in libraries and librarians. So just being able to kind of find ways to work that into your daily life could be very beneficial. And I think one thing, all these things are things we talk about self-care, things we can do. Sometimes just not doing something is the best, making time to be bored, so just to deliberately do nothing, and to experience what is it like to be bored. In the society that we live in is so hectic, boredom itself can be a luxury. And so, like for me, like I have a weighted blanket. And so I sometimes will just lay under my weighted blanket with my little dog and just be like, I'm not going to do anything, and I'm not going to think about anything, and I'm just going to sit here and be bored for a little bit. And then I feel much better. I feel refreshed after that. So just kind of thinking about that. Now, there are some things you can really do in your workplace too. So trying to avoid that burnout syndrome that we've talked about. And so one thing, and I used to be guilty of this, but I'm better about it now, but respecting your own time. So don't arrive early, don't stay late. If you're supposed to work from 8 to 5 and you're supposed to have a 1-hour lunch in between, always do that. So the work is not going to go away. It's always going to be there. You're hired to be there a certain amount of time. And if the work can't be done in that amount of time, then something needs to be renegotiated or changed. But, really respecting your time, that you're going to have your home life and your work life. Try to use your email autoresponder feature that's going to tell people when you're available. Now that for some people, they only use that when they're going on vacation. I'm going to be out of the office on vacation, but it's actually something you can use on the daily. So it can be something like, this email is not checked after 5 p.m. or on weekends. You might want to set times in the day when you only check it. This email would be checked from 12 to 3 daily or something. So you can let people know when you're going to check it and when you're not going to check it. And that's where scheduling that time to check your email can be important. So every time, you're trying to do something and then the email goes off and you shift your attention to the email, 9 times out of 10, it's nothing important. It's just some little thing, but it got you off task. You're not focused on what you were doing. Maybe it stressed you out because it's something you didn't really want to think about right at that moment until you finish this other thing. So you don't have to leave your email on all day long. So I think you know that, but, I would just say have certain times of the day when you check your email, and then having it off so that you can focus on other things other times. Because we're going to talk a little bit about mindfulness, but, being able to do one thing at a time is really undervalued in our society. So there's a lot of emphasis on multitasking, and the more you can get done at one time, you're some kind of hero for doing that. Really, though, that's creating a lot of stress and chaos. And you're maybe not even getting those things done well. So really being able to just do one thing at a time and focus on it can really be, more productive and be less stressful for you. Your cell phone, whether you're at home, at the office, using that do not disturb function on your cell phone and on your office phone too, so that you can focus. So if you're saying I'm doing this from 9 to 10, I am working on this one thing, don't feel like you got to look at your phone every time it goes off or answer your phone at your desk every time, it rings. You can get back to people. They can leave a message, all those things. But those things are going to help you just to kind of keep your focus and feel less, stressed being pulled in different directions. Another thing, is to think about, and this came up somewhat in the breakout session that I was in, is take time to look at your job description. Like, are the things that you're doing in your job description, are you getting paid to do these things? Are these things that people are asking you to do or telling you to do that really aren't even part of your job or something you even should be doing? So reviewing that, with your supervisor, your admin, and also looking at your annual performance goals, so what are your priorities? So if you have too many goals of what you can possibly do in a year's time, trying to clarify and prioritize what are these job duties, what do you need to focus on? And if there's things you're doing that really aren't part of your job description, I'm not telling you to say, oh, I refuse to do that and get fired, but having conversation about those things and saying, why am I doing this? It's not part of my job description. Does it need to be added? Do I need to be compensated? Does somebody else need to do it? So just taking a minute to look at those things. And you can renegotiate things, hopefully, with your supervisor. So things that you're doing that you're feeling very burned out on, maybe somebody else wants to do those things and you can do some other things they've been doing. And so, again, maybe something like, for me, I was doing reference and that really wasn't my thing. So I shifted more into outreach, and that was really, for me, very something I've enjoyed. And it was my coworkers that enjoyed reference and didn't like outreach. That was good for them. So there's all kinds of ways you can kind of look at things and renegotiate. It's not that you're doing less, but you're just trying to do things that are maybe more meaningful to you, and maybe just kind of reconfiguring that. So you got to take your daily breaks. I know this, and you know this, but just get up and walk. If the weather's nice, go outside. If it's not nice, walk around your building or go sit in a different room or go sit in your car or something like that. But just having that break where you're out of your office, you're away for a minute, and you come back, that would be really beneficial. Boundaries. We're going to talk about boundaries in a minute, because really part of taking care of yourself is really having really clear and healthy boundaries with people that come in your library, coworkers, people in your life. Also, make sure you use your vacation and your sick leave so you have paid time off, hopefully, and use that time. Don't let it just accumulate or, not use it, or, use it or lose it, that kind of thing. And if you're a manager, an administrator, make it possible for people that you're working with to use that leave. Don't make it so stressful for them that they don't feel like they can take their leave. So that's something that's really important for people to have that time away to prevent things like burnout, or maybe they need that time off to take care of themselves, to go get some, counseling or whatever it is they need to do. But people should be able to use their breaks. And that's one thing I want to talk about too, is that self-care is wonderful, all these things we can do for ourselves, but sometimes that puts the burden on the individual, like they're supposed to do these things, like we're going to have really stressful jobs, and it's up to us to make sure that we kind of take care of ourselves so we can keep doing those stressful jobs. A lot of this comes back to the organizational culture. What is the organization doing to help us have a life-work balance. So it's not just on us to keep up with something that's just not feasible to keep up with. So those of you that are maybe in more administrative positions, is to think about what can you do as an administrator to create an organizational culture that really supports self-care and is nurturing for your staff. And again, you can just say no sometimes. So, if it's in your job description, you're paid to do it, you got to do it. But some things are extras. Maybe people want to collaborate on something and, do something together. And it sounds great, but you're just overwhelmed. And so I think it's fine to say to people, like, I want you to feel free to ask me to do these things. And in return, I'm going to feel, I can feel like I can say no if it's not in my best interest, if I need to not take on too much. And so you're not just saying no to everything, but you're just letting people know you're open to things, but you'll say no if it's in the interest of your own self-care. But boundaries are important. I've done a whole, webinar on boundaries. So I think they are so important with our self-care because without good boundaries, it becomes very difficult to, set those limits for ourselves about what's going to be good for us. So a boundary, when we're talking about a boundary, it really is a guideline or limit that somebody has in place to identify, what are some permissible ways for other people to behave around them, and how are they going to respond if those limits are not kept. So that could be, as librarians, in terms of our work environment, that could be our, behavior use policies. It could be how we're going to interact with our coworkers, and in our personal lives as well. So just what are those ways that are okay, and if that's not respected, what are you going to do? So there's some things that are boundaries that really just, you should never have to answer to. You should never have to respond to or provide an answer to. So a coworker, patron. So you shouldn't, you never have to. You can, but you never have to share anything about your personal, physical, or mental health concerns. So that's up to you if you feel like you want to share it or not. You don't have to tell people what your sexual orientation is. You don't have to share information about your family. You certainly don't have to tell, people what you do outside of work, and these are all, if you want to, fine. If you don't have to. Spirituality, that's only your business. How you feel about political things, that's up to you to disclose or not disclose. And another boundary is you don't have to be exposed to people's inappropriate comments or language. I know we all have, patrons that come in and they may have some mental health issues, and we understand that, but there have to be some limits in terms of how people interact with us and what we're going to permit. So putting some limits on those things. And also, obviously physical touch, invasion of personal space is just never okay. So what we're really trying to do is have a really good work-life balance. So we don't want to have one thing outweigh the other, but what's right is going to vary from person to person. So what I consider to be a good balance may not be the same for somebody else. So it's just going to depend on you and what feels right to you. So just thinking about, what are some barriers that you might face in making that balance, and how are you going to address them? So you don't want to just say, well, I'm going to have to work more hours to get rid of, I'm never going to get caught up, so I'm just going to work more. That's not really going to be a good way, to cope with that kind of work-life balance. So some people do that. They just say, I'm just so stressed out if I don't get in here and get more done. That's the only thing I know to do. But of course, the work never stops. So, some barriers would be, thinking about, like you mentioned, the organizational culture, your workload if you're understaffed, and also thinking about, is it the case where you work that the people who work a lot and don't have a great work-life balance. Maybe they're stressed out because they're maybe workaholics, that kind of thing. Maybe they're getting rewarded. They're the ones that get the raise or the staff member of the year, or they get the praise. And so maybe what we need to think about is, are we praising people that are showing us that they have a good work-life balance? Are they being recognized, for taking care of themselves and for coming to work refreshed and, balanced? And so what can we do as libraries to recognize that as well? So that's something we can think about too. So, just kind of getting back to self-care. So it can be overwhelming if you're not one to do self-care, like you just don't think that's for you, or you haven't really, considered it too much, or maybe you have and it hasn't been something that you've been able to do consistently, is to think about, how can you make these changes for yourself last, not just, okay, I'm inspired, I'm going to go do it, and the next week I'm not doing it anymore. So just try to focus on one behavior at a time. So it could be something small. It could just be, maybe you don't get up all day, you sit at your desk all day, but now you're going to get up and walk for a few minutes every day or something like that. Or you're going to, make sure you drink enough water, and then, just starting small. So there's a technique in psychology called shaping a behavior. You probably have done this with your pet. So like if you have a dog that doesn't know how to do any tricks, and you kind of get them to do a little bit at a time, like trying to roll over, the dog makes a small movement, you give them a treat. He rolls a little bit more, gets another treat. Before you know it, the dog can do the whole routine, no problem. Same with us. So if you don't ever walk, you don't ever, drink water, you don't ever do these things, doing something, starting small. So if you say, I want to walk 30 minutes a day, but I'm not doing anything right now, start committing to yourself that you're going to walk 10 minutes a day, or even 10 minutes every other day. And then, after you've done that for a couple of weeks, well, now you're going to do 15, well, then you're going to do 20. And before you know it, you're easily doing 30 minutes, and it's something that you have formed into a habit. There's all kinds of stuff out there, like how many days or how long does it take to form a habit. There's not really any truth to that. Everybody's different. So you'll know that it's a habit if you don't have to really think about it. If you don't have to, deliberately set a timer to go do it. It just becomes something that you're just doing. It has become a habit. It's something you don't maybe not always enjoy it, but it's something that has become part of your daily routine, and something that you just do. And then once you got that down pat, you can maybe start adding in something else. So you don't want to just, overwhelm yourself with lots of changes at one time, because that can be stressful. And then reward yourself when you're making these healthy choices. Give yourself some kind of reward to encourage yourself to keep doing that. Something, healthy reward is good, but, even just, maybe if you did all your walking that week, you're going to allow yourself to watch, your favorite TV show or something. Or you're going to order a movie to watch, or something that you enjoy, whatever's fun for you. Get your nails done or whatever. But don't forget to reward yourself for doing these things. Now, we've had that self-care assessment plan. There's also a mind maintenance self-care plan. So once you've kind of done your assessment, this is something that you can go through and do this worksheet so that you can really make a plan for how are you going to stick to it. So if you write something down, if you make a plan, it's more likely that you're going to stick to it. So this plan does talk about, everything: your mind, body, emotions, spirit. It's got, you're going to list activities. And the most important thing about this is it's the chance for you to identify what are some barriers you're going to face. Go ahead and anticipate, as much as you want to walk 10 minutes a day, what's going to happen? Okay, I'm going to get stuck in a meeting, or my kid's going to call and say she's sick, or, what is it that's could potentially pop up? And then how are you going to address it? What are you going to do to make sure you still do that activity that's really good for you? And it also helps you look at what are some things that are some negative coping mechanisms that you're using right now, and how can you replace it? So maybe if your thing is, I'm fried from work, I'm going to sit on the couch and eat bag of chips. Well, maybe you can have a piece of fruit, and not sit on the couch as long. You're going to sit on the couch for a little bit and eat your fruit, and then you're going to go for a walk. Or, so what are some ways that you can kind of start to work on replacing some of those? So just take some time to do that. Mindfulness, just wanted to talk about that quickly. Again, there's entire webinars on this, there's entire books on this, but just to make sure that you kind of know what it is. Mindfulness is just the moment-to-moment awareness of your experience without judgment. So it's not really like meditation in terms of just trying to get into a certain state of mind. You're just being aware of what's going on around you and noticing it and not saying it's good or it's bad or you should or you shouldn't. It's whatever thoughts come through your head, whatever you are hearing or seeing or whatever, you're just noticing it. You're just becoming more mindful of what's going on around you. So if you want to get started with that, is again, just setting aside some time. You don't really need any kind of yoga mat or anything special. You just kind of set aside some time. And you're just trying to observe the moment as it is. You're not trying to feel like some kind of Zen moment. You're just noticing and paying attention to what's going on around you. And then just, if you are judging things, it's only natural. It's going to pop into your head about things. Just notice it and then let it pass. Don't judge yourself for judging yourself. And then get back to the present moment. Just, okay, I noticed that I'm thinking this, okay, and then go back to what you're doing. And you may have to redirect yourself again and again and again. Over time, as you do this, it becomes more, you won't have to do that as much. And that's kind of where you realize that you are becoming mindful, is you're able to do that without constantly having to bring yourself back to the moment. But again, don't be hard on yourself. Don't criticize yourself if this, it's just something you're doing. You're making an effort. It's not something you're trying to be perfect at. It's just making that time for yourself to do that. So some outcomes, if we really do this and make an effort to try to do some of this, and again, there's apps out there you can do. Some people do this, just 10 minutes a day or something. It's so small amount of time that can have a benefit. If you do kind of practice this regularly, you might find that, you're less reactive to things. So you're more kind of, again, in the moment and more responsive and less reactive. You're more aware of what's going on around you. Like you might notice there's things, I never noticed that was triggering me. I never noticed that sound bothered me, or that I was thinking this and feeling this, so you're more aware of it. And then you can kind of act and engage with awareness and attention. So instead of being torn between all these different things that are coming at you, you're kind of more in the moment, addressing each thing as it comes along. And not judging so much what you're experiencing. You feel how you feel about something, you think how you think, and not trying to be so hard on yourself if it's not, what you think it should be. And just being able to do one thing at a time, like we mentioned, that's a skill to be able to develop in today's world. Okay, so we're gonna have a little breakout session, and then we're gonna come back and talk about how do we know if things are becoming a mental health issue. So this time, what I want you to do in your sessions is just to talk about, how proactive have you been in using your self-care strategies? Maybe you haven't, at all. What are some challenges that you have if you've tried to do this and you've not been able to? What are some challenges? And what are one or two things that you could start doing? What could you kind of commit to, or would you like to commit to, just to start, getting incorporated into your life? And then we'll come back and finish up the slides. We're all back again. If there's anybody that wanted to continue anything, I think some of us might get cut off, but feel free if you want to unmute yourself or talk about that. We're just talking about my group, about things we are doing or not doing in terms of self-care and how other people might perceive that if we are doing these things, like sticking to our work schedules and different things. Are people going to see us as doing less, so that's kind of the discussions that we've been having. And I think, talking about that with coworkers and your supervisors, and, just being, transparent about what you're doing and why you're doing it, and kind of setting that good example for your other coworkers if you're doing that too. So, all right. I'm not sure. If anybody wants to speak now, feel free. Otherwise, I'm gonna get my slides going here, but got a little bit more to cover. Let's see here.
I'll just jump in and reiterate one thing while you're doing that. Like I was saying, this year in particular, I think I've done a lot better with being kind with myself. Like if I fall off the bandwagon, so to speak, with my good habits, if I don't exercise for a couple of days, just being kind to myself and recognizing that that happens, it makes it easier for me to get back to those things. If I tell myself that's not the end of the world. That doesn't mean that you're never going to do it again. And it makes it easier to get back to them. So
sometimes it feels good to skip that day at the gym. That's a form of self-care too. You can get too intense over those things. So
and I'm gonna there's a couple of people who are talking about like the quiet quitting that's been in the news recently in the chat. I absolutely 150% think that is self-care. That's not quitting, that's doing your job and leaving your work at work. And I think like for myself personally when COVID happened, that whole experience really helped me prioritize what was really important in my life. And for me, that was not work. For me, that was being able to be with my family and like actually make memories and spend time together. And so that has led me, as I go into to now wanting to make sure that that's always stays as a priority, and that any job I take, that's going to be something that plays into it. How impactful is that going to be in that time? And how is it going to translate to me being able to spend time with family and friends and like be there for them? So.
Hopefully organizations are starting to realize that too, and starting to recognize that this is to their benefit to have employees that are happy and well balanced and not so stressed. So yeah, some good things did come out of COVID, I think, in terms of how we perceive our work-life balance. Yeah. Okay. We'll launch into this next part here. We'll have a little more time towards the end to talk. So just mental health services. So sometimes, talk about burnout, vicarious trauma, things like that. But sometimes there's other things that could be going on that we might need to think about, maybe going to see a counselor or getting some kind of mental health services. So one of the key things I look at, any psychologist when we're diagnosing something is there impairment in somebody's functioning? So we all have moments where we're a little anxious, a little moody, a little depressed, but is this really starting to cause a problem in your functioning, not just at work, but at home, your, social relationships, all different kinds of things, is it impairing you? And has it really not resolved, even though you may have tried some of these things? So maybe you're going to do all these self-care things and make these adjustments at work, but you're still having some concerns there that are causing a problem. And maybe you need more intensive assistance to stick to a self-care plan. Maybe you don't have an anxiety disorder or a mood disorder, but you just haven't been able to stick to a self-care plan and you need to. So those are all the reasons why you might say, I'm going to kind of seek out some mental health services. So what are some possible mental health concerns that we could experience? This could be in any field, but some common things just to kind of start to differentiate for yourself. And I'm not going to read all this out to you, but some more common mental disorders that people experience would be major depressive disorder. So this is something that's different than being burned out. I just wrote a chapter for a book. It's coming out, I think this winter. It's called Academic Librarian Burnout. And I wrote a chapter about how to differentiate burnout from depression. So, depression is a mental disorder where, you're having some of these symptoms that you see here for 2 weeks or more, so this is something that's just not going away. So you've got not only the depressed mood, but you might notice some big changes in your weight, and that could be up or down. How you're feeling slowed down and things, fatigue, feeling super guilty, not able to concentrate, and maybe even thinking about harming yourself. So that's where you're crossing into that territory of maybe this is something that would be more like a major depressive disorder rather than burnout. Another one that you might experience would be generalized anxiety disorder. So this is when somebody's just so worried and anxious that they just can't turn this off. So it's not, It's just become where they can't relax. They feel tired because by being uptight and tired, anxious all the time, it really makes you tired. They can't concentrate, being very irritable, not sleeping well. So if this has been going on for at least 6 months, and you're like, this is not just situational stress, this is something I can't stop worrying, even though I'm sitting here doing something I am enjoying, that might be, again, where you've crossed into something that might need a little more intensive addressing in terms of anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder. And then there's also post-traumatic stress disorder. So we talked about vicarious trauma, but there's also times when you may have directly experienced something traumatic. And I think I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of recognition now about things that we've experienced in our childhood. The more adverse childhood experiences you've had, the more likely you are to have something like PTSD when something does happen to you. And so, PTSD is a very specific diagnosis where somebody has been exposed to either actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. And this can be you directly experienced it, you witnessed it, or even if you heard about this happening to somebody close to you, is traumatic. And then you start to have some intrusion symptoms. So you start having memories about what happened. You're having nightmares. You might even dissociate at times, getting very reactive to triggers going around you, trying to avoid things that remind you of what happened. Those are all things that are more PTSD than, say, vicarious trauma. Another thing that goes along with PTSD is similar to vicarious trauma. You start to think about the world in a really negative way. And so, and this can be kind of a combination of things. You might not even be able to, if somebody says what happened, you might not even be able to get to that memory to talk about what happened. You might just be really exaggerated about you're terrible, the world's terrible, you're an awful person, just not interested in things you used to be interested in, and just not able to experience positive emotions like you previously were. And then that reactivity. So you might be more likely to lash out or to do things that are self-destructive, like we mentioned, again, similar to the vicarious trauma, startling easily, being hypervigilant. So if these have been going on for more than a month, it might be time to start thinking about talking to somebody about maybe some possible PTSD that could be going on for you. So those are just a little handful of things. There's lots of things we could be experiencing. But again, if it's crossed that line for you where it's like, you really do feel like you need to talk to somebody, sometimes it can be intimidating to find, like, how do you even get started with counseling? I think it's more commonplace now that people do go for mental health services. But to kind of get into that, if you're not quite sure how to start, a lot of times people will have an employee assistance program at EAP. I'm sure most of you have this where you work, and that's just where your employer will pay for so many sessions. They have a contract with somebody that does counseling, and you can get hooked up with them to have so many sessions. That's usually something, the benefit that's offered. Otherwise, you can go to your primary care doctor. They know who's in the area. They know you well, and they can refer you to somebody for counseling. So you can kind of trust them to do that. Now, a lot of times if you have insurance, you don't even need a referral, though. Your doctor can refer you just because maybe you want their help to get, in with the practice. But most of the time, if you have private insurance, even Medicaid for adults, you don't have to have a referral. You can just go to somebody that's in your network. So you can contact your insurance provider and just find a list of who's in your area, and then call them and set up that appointment. So what to expect is that once you get into therapy, if you do that, is to know, just like with self-care, it's not going to be a quick fix. It does take time to build a therapeutic relationship with somebody and to start talking about things, but also doing the things that they're going to recommend that you try and do. And that's something that you'll see benefits in over the long term. And, just knowing that whatever you do share with your counselor is confidential. It's completely protected by HIPAA, so that's not something that they're going to talk about with anybody else. And then if you go see a counselor, so this could be an LCSW, an LPC, a psychologist, they don't prescribe medication. So if you feel like your doctor feels, you feel, or maybe your counselor feels that you need medication in addition to therapy, then you would want to be seen either by a psychiatrist, or sometimes your family doctor will feel comfortable prescribing medication. But so that's just to kind of be aware that they don't prescribe medication. Yeah, so these were just some national mental health resources that I was going to call your attention to. One thing that's changed is the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. I'm sure a lot of you have heard that's now a national 988 number, so anybody can just call that number. This would be something that's nice to share with your patrons that are coming in, and maybe especially if you're asking for information about mental health topics, and maybe they're trying to find resources. So there's a whole list of different things here that people can access to get help with if they need to. And then I have some additional readings here. A lot of these are just freely available online, but they're just some additional articles about burnout. A lot of us have talked about, there's the last article there, other duties as assigned, talking about things that we're having this pressure to do more and more of, and where do we kind of draw the line on some of those things. Mindfulness, or some other resources here for that. So if that kind of resonated with you and it's something that you want to get started with, there's lots of different resources. Some of these are books you'd have to purchase, others are just freely available online. There's lots of webinars that are out there, so I've given you some links to some of the ones that I've been able to kind of curate over time and find. So if you want to learn more about, some of these are vicarious trauma, some are about self-care and mindfulness. Okay, so that kind of covers all of my slides. So I just wanted to kind of open it up to see if we wanted to use any more time for people to talk, because we had a pretty good discussion going there. Is there anything else that anybody wants to ask questions about or to discuss? This would be, we have a few minutes to do that if anybody wants to.
I don't know if you saw the chat, but everyone was very engaged earlier. So there are a lot of comments in the chat about things you were talking about. So it was a great session.
Yeah. I hope these are things that are going to be helpful, and that you've made some connections with other people here that are working in similar jobs and facing similar situations, and you can kind of reach out to each other after this too and keep the discussion going. And are there any questions about the mental health aspect? Any questions about, kind of differentiating when to get help or what to do? Or is that, you might need some time just to think about it, consider that. So
examples there.
Yeah, and I think the thing is, I want people to know that you don't have to have a mental disorder to go to counseling. So even if you don't have something like depression or generalized anxiety disorder, a lot of people come to counseling just to kind of almost like having to the dentist. It's kind of preventative care. You're doing things for yourself. You don't have to have a mental health issue to go see a counselor.
I do have a question, actually, that because I experienced a trauma several years ago. I very unexpectedly and rather traumatically lost my horse to a medical issue, and not surprisingly had a lot of grief around that. And friends and family would encourage me to talk about it, and it's, I recognize that they were trying to be helpful, but for me personally, I often feel like I can't talk about those things immediately, and that I need a good amount of time where I just don't talk about it. And at the time I was like, is this normal? I don't know. It felt abnormal to me, but I guess it falls under the, we all process these traumas and stresses differently. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts or suggestions about that.
Yeah, I mean, we have a saying, among us psychologists, is that normal is a setting on a dryer. So, everybody is different, and for you, if you know that that's how you process things, is you needed time, and you're still functioning, you're still going to work, you're still doing all the things you needed to do, but you were just having kind of a normal grief response to this, I think that would be fine. If it started to limit you, like, I don't want to get another horse, I don't want to see other people riding horses, I don't want to do anything like that, I don't want to ever have another pet, whatever, then that would be where you really need to probably say, well, my life isn't full anymore because of this. I'm letting it get the better of me, But yeah, what takes, what's normal to you would be somebody else might have a different experience, And if it's continued, so sometimes there's people have experienced, there's a new diagnosis called complex PTSD. Doesn't necessarily sound like what you're experiencing, but like people have had multiple things happen to them over time, some major, some minor. And because it's been like kind of just over and over and over again, it's harder to treat and it's more impairs them. So that's something to kind of be aware of too, is if you have a traumatic background and you're working somewhere where you're getting the vicarious trauma or other things are happening, that could set you up for needing more help with those things. But is there anything else in the chat I need to take a look at, or?
More comments than anything. Peg commented, and
my book.
I totally agree.
That chapter. Yeah, we've been working on that for a while. It's going to be coming out through ACRL. I think it's supposed to be like in January. It's close, but it's going to be like my topic, but lots of other topics as well, specific to academic librarians, and just acknowledging that there is burnout there, and some of it is what do you do about it. Mine is kind of again differentiating that from something like depression. So that may be something if you're interested in. It's going to be coming out pretty soon. So yeah, there's lots of resources out there. There's tons of books on vicarious trauma and just all different things like that. Oh, so somebody was talking about the links in the chat.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Stacy, are you able to save chat? I know that's possible in Zoom.
Mm-hmm.
I believe I can export the chat. I know I can get we're recording, so we'll have the video for sure.
Yeah. All right, we will figure something out.
And then the slides, are those going to be available from the conference site?
Yes, we will make the slides available as well. Again, either I'm not sure on the website, or we can possibly email them to the attendees or registrants.
And I guess the question is, Dawn, are you okay with us posting them on the website, or should we email them
fine.
to?
No,
okay, all right, I'll post them then.
I appreciate you all taking the time for this today and having the interest in it. So always enjoy talking about these topics and meeting other librarians. It's always fun. All right. Well, that's all I have. So I'm going to say goodbye.
Thank you so much.
You all had a great conference.
Yeah. That was a great session. Thank you.
And take care.
It was.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, everyone, we have a nice break, and I hope to see you all back at noon for NNLM National Evaluation Center, noon Central Time.